In a small town in the state of Maine, there is a place known as Pine Hollow. This forest is not like any other forest. Surrounded by dense fog for most of the year, Pine Hollow is famous for its gloomy atmosphere and spooky stories that have been part of local legends for generations. In the early 19th century, deep in the wilderness of the state of Maine, there was a small community that lived peacefully. They live around Pine Hollow, a dense forest full of towering pine trees. The inhabitants lived modestly, relying on forest products and agriculture. However, their calm is soon disturbed by the arrival of a man named Nathaniel Blackwood. Nathaniel Blackwood was a wealthy lumber magnate. He came to Pine Hollow with the intention of exploiting the abundant natural resources there. With his wealth, he bought most of the land in Pine Hollow and forced the local population to work under terrible conditions. Nathaniel is a cunning and cruel man, indifferent to the well-being of his workers. He only cares about the benefits he can get. The residents of Pine Hollow initially welcomed Nathaniel warmly, hoping that he would bring prosperity to their community. However, their hopes are soon shattered when Nathaniel shows his dark side. He ordered a massive felling of trees, causing the once beautiful forest to turn into a barren and arid region. Workers were forced to work from morning to night without adequate rest, and many fell ill or died from exhaustion and poor working conditions. Nathaniel did not care about their suffering. For him, money and power are everything. Until one day, a desperate worker, John Carver, rebelled. John Carver was a brave and passionate young worker. He could not stand to see the suffering of his comrades. John decided to gather courage and lead a rebellion against Nathaniel. He managed to gather several other workers who also felt angry and desperate. However, their plans are discovered by Nathaniel. In a cruel act of revenge, Nathaniel captures John and hangs him on the oldest tree in Pine Hollow as a warning to the others. That night, a strong wind blew and the sound of John's screams echoed throughout the forest. The frightened villagers could only watch in horror, while John breathed his last. Not long after, Nathaniel Blackwood and his family began to experience unexplained events. Strange sounds are heard in their house, dark shadows move in the corners of the rooms, and the feeling of being constantly watched haunts them. Night after night, the terror intensified. One dark night, Nathaniel woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway of his house. He got out of bed and followed the voice. The footsteps led him into the forest, to the tree where John Carver was hanged. There, in the dim light of the full moon, Nathaniel saw the figure of John standing in front of a tree, looking at him with vengeful eyes. Nathaniel tried to escape, but his feet felt as if they were embedded in the ground. John's voice was clear in his ears.
"You're going to pay for what you did."
Suddenly, Nathaniel felt something entangle his neck. He fell thrashed, but there was nothing he could do. Within seconds, Nathaniel was hanging from the same tree as John, his face showing an incredible expression of fear. Nathaniel Blackwood's death marked the beginning of the curse of Pine Hollow. The forest was a place feared by the villagers. Many left the village, unable to cope with the continuing terror. Those who live in fear, always feel watched and often hear strange noises at night. The legend about John Carver and Nathaniel Blackwood became a story told from generation to generation. Pine Hollow became a symbol of evil and justice that was finally upheld, albeit through terrible means. The tree on which they were hung became a sacred place that the villagers shunned, as they believed that John's spirit was still there, guarding the forest from those who intended evil. Generation after generation, the story of Nathaniel Blackwood and the cursed forest of Pine Hollow continues. However, no one can prove the truth of the story. Until one day, the Wilson family moved to the city. They were a seemingly normal family: Henry Wilson, a doctor, his wife Margaret, and their two children, Lily and Ethan. Henry and Margaret decide to move to Pine Hollow because they want to get away from the hustle and bustle of the big city and seek a quieter life. They bought an old house on the edge of the forest, which had not been inhabited for a long time and needed a lot of repairs. At first, everything went well. The Wilson family enjoyed the tranquility and beauty of nature around them. However, not long after they moved in, strange things began to happen. The first night in their new home, 8-year-old Lily hears strange sounds from the direction of the forest. He hears a whisper calling his name, but when he tells his parents, they just say that it's probably just a nocturnal animal. In the days that followed, strange events happened more and more often. The things in the house moved by themselves, the sound of footsteps was heard in the hall at night, and dark shadows were seen moving on the periphery of their gaze. Henry, initially skeptical, begins to feel that something is wrong. He decided to investigate the history of the house and the surrounding forest. From the locals, he hears stories about Nathaniel Blackwood and the curse of Pine Hollow. Although it sounds like a legend, Henry cannot ignore the strange events that keep happening in his house. One evening, while Margaret was preparing dinner, she saw the shadow of a man in the kitchen. When he turned around, the shadow disappeared, leaving behind a bone-chilling chill. Henry tries to convince Margaret that it is only his own shadow, but in his heart, he knows that there is something more. A few days later, 10-year-old Ethan had a very real nightmare. He dreamed of a man with a face full of wounds, standing in the middle of the forest, calling his name. When Ethan awoke, he found dirty handprints on his bed, as if someone had touched him while he slept. Henry decided that it was time to seek help. He contacted a well-known psychic, Dr. Abigail Mason, who has a reputation for dealing with supernatural cases. Dr. Abigail Mason arrives at Pine Hollow quickly. A middle-aged woman with keen eyes and a deep knowledge of the occult world, she has dealt with many similar cases across the country. After hearing Henry's story, he agrees to help them. That night, Dr. Mason held a séance session at the Wilson family home. He uses candles, crystals, and other tools that he carries with him to try to communicate with the spirits that disturb them. During the session, the room temperature suddenly drops dramatically. Candles flickered, and whispering voices began to be heard. Dr. Mason closed his eyes and concentrated. "Who are you and what do you want?" he asked in a firm voice. The room fell silent for a moment. Then an eerie low voice said,
I am John Carver. I seek justice for my unjust death.
Dr. Mason tries to calm the spirit, explaining that the Wilson family is innocent and just wants to live in peace. However, the spirit of John Carver continued to insist.
Nathaniel Blackwood must pay. Blood must be paid for with blood.
After the session, Dr. Mason realizes that John Carver's spirit is tied to the forest and tree where he was killed. He explains to the Wilson family that the only way to stop this terror is to perform a purification ritual at the place where John was hanged. Under the guidance of Dr. Mason, the Wilson family prepare for the purification ritual. They must go into the woods and find the tree where John Carver was hanged. That night, under the full moonlight, they entered Pine Hollow carefully. As they approached the old tree in question, a strong wind began to blow and strange noises were heard from all directions. Dr. the Mason begins his ritual, lights a candle and casts a spell in ancient Latin. The atmosphere became even more tense when the shadow of John Carver appeared in front of them. John looked at them with hateful eyes.
You can't stop this. Nathaniel Blackwood has to pay.
Dr. Mason replied calmly, John Carver, we have come to give you peace. We bring you a symbol of justice. Henry then pulled out a small object from his jacket pocket, a gold necklace belonging to Nathaniel Blackwood that he had found hidden in their house. Dr. Mason continued the spell, and the necklace began to glow with a bright light. The shadow of John Carver approached the necklace, his face turning from hateful to calm.
Finally, peace,
he whispered before disappearing into the mist. After the ritual is over, the forest atmosphere calms down again. The Wilson family was relieved and grateful to Dr. Mason for his help. They return home with the feeling that everything will be fine. From that night on, strange events in their house stopped. No more strange noises, dark shadows, or nightmares. Pine Hollow Forest remains a mysterious place, but the curse has disappeared. Henry, Margaret, Lily, and Ethan begin to enjoy their lives in Pine Hollow. They are aware that while legends and scary stories are real, they also teach about the power of courage, justice, and peace. The Wilson family lived their lives peacefully in Pine Hollow. They always remember the terrible experience as a valuable lesson. Dr. Mason became a close friend of their family, visiting often and making sure everything was fine. The legend about Nathaniel Blackwood and John Carver continues in the city, but now with a more peaceful ending. Pine Hollow remains a place full of mystery, but also a place where justice is finally established and peace is found. Pine Hollow, a dense forest that holds dark secrets and unimaginable terrors. Locals often talk about strange noises, sightings of shadows, and the feeling of being constantly watched when near the forest. One of the scariest stories of Pine Hollow is about a dark night that befell a group of teenagers who tried to challenge the legend of the cursed forest. It all started on Halloween night. 6 teenagers from the town, Mark, Sarah, Tom, Emily, Kevin, and Lisa, decide to test their mettle by entering Pine Hollow. They have heard many spooky stories from their parents and elders, but they think of them only as ghost stories to scare children. Come on, it's just an old forest. There is nothing to be afraid of, said Mark, the leader of the group, confidently. They brought flashlights, cameras, and some provisions, ready to prove that Pine Hollow is just an ordinary forest. The night was pitch black, the moon covered in thick clouds, and fog began to fall as they entered Pine Hollow. The air was cold and humid, with the smell of earth and rotting leaves. Although they try to stay cheerful, the gloomy atmosphere of the forest begins to make them feel uncomfortable. Their every step is accompanied by the sound of broken branches and trampled leaves. The usual sounds of the night sounded eerie in the middle of the forest. The wind blew slowly, carrying faint whispers that seemed to call to them. As they went deeper into the forest, their flashlights began to flicker. "This can't be happening," Kevin muttered as he tapped his flashlight that was starting to dim. Without warning, all their flashlights went out simultaneously, leaving them in complete darkness. "Calm down, we can use the cell phone light," Emily suggested, trying to stay calm. However, their cell phones could not turn on either, as if there was a greater force in that forest that turned off all light sources. As they try to stay together, the sound of heavy, rough footsteps is heard from behind the trees. "Who's there?" shouted Mark, but there was no answer. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, accompanied by heavy breathing sounds that were clearly audible in their ears. Suddenly, Lisa screamed. "Something touched me," he said in panic. They all felt anxious and scared, and decided to run. In the dark, they try to stay together, but shadows and strange sounds keep them apart from each other. Sarah and Tom manage to stay together and find an old cottage that seems to have been abandoned for a long time. They went into the hut for shelter, hoping to calm down and wait until morning. However, inside the hut, they find evidence from a terrible past, old photographs showing frightened-looking villagers, and strange writings on the walls that look like spells or curses. Meanwhile, Mark, Emily, Kevin, and Lisa are separated and each face their own terrors. Mark saw the shadow of a man with a face full of wounds, standing among the trees, looking at him with fiery red eyes. Emily heard strange voices calling her name, making her run without a clear direction. Kevin felt followed by something invisible, and Lisa found herself in a circle of trees that seemed alive and moving. Sarah and Tom, still in the hut, sense a strange and frightening presence. The room temperature suddenly dropped dramatically, and black shadows began to move on the walls. They heard a voice whisper,
"Go, or you will have the same fate as US."
Meanwhile, Mark, who was running in the forest, fell and saw something terrible, corpses hanging from trees, with faces full of fear and empty eyes staring down. Voices from the past began to fill his head, driving him almost crazy. Emily, separated from the others, finds a large stone with an ancient inscription that seems to tell about the curse of Pine Hollow. The writing described how Nathaniel Blackwood and his family had cursed this forest with blood and death. Everyone who enters the forest with bad intentions will face the wrath of the spirits trapped there. Realizing that they need to get out of the forest as quickly as possible, a separate group begins to look for a way out. Sarah and Tom manage to find their way back to the path they used to enter the forest. There, they are reunited with Emily, who looks very frightened, but carries important information about the curse of the forest. The three of them decided to look for the others and immediately got out of the forest. The sound of footsteps and heavy breathing returned, making them run with all their might. When they find Kevin and Lisa, they are all reunited, except for Mark, who is still missing. They finally found Mark hanging from a tree, with a frightened expression on his face. There was no time to grieve. They had to get out of the woods before anything worse happened. With all their strength and fear, they ran out of Pine Hollow. Strange voices and black shadows continue to pursue them. They feel as if the forest is alive and trying to keep them in it. After running for what felt like hours, they finally saw a light in the distance, the sign that they were almost out of the woods. As soon as they came out of the forest, the voices stopped, and the atmosphere calmed down. They turned around and saw the gloomy and dark-looking Pine Hollow forest behind them. When they returned to the city, they tell of their terrible experience, and people begin to believe the legend of the cursed forest more than ever. Since that night, no one dared to enter Pine Hollow anymore. The forest remained a place of fear and respect. The story of 6 teenagers trying to challenge the legend of the cursed forest serves as a warning to everyone that Pine Hollow is not a place to be underestimated. On certain nights, the sounds of screams and cries are still heard from within the forest, reminding the townspeople that angry spirits still roam Pine Hollow, seeking the peace they never found.